The plus-size baker was humiliated and fired. Nobody expected the Mafia boss to ask for her by name. The termination letter was sitting on top of the cake she had spent 14 hours making. Nadia did not see it at first. She walked into the prestige patisserie kitchen at 4:45 in the morning, the way she always did. Coat still on, keys still in her hand, eyes going straight to the work table to check the temperature of the ganache she had left setting overnight. The ganache was fine. The 4-tier wedding cake she had assembled the evening before was standing perfectly, draped in ivory fondant so smooth it looked like poured silk. She had carved hand-pressed sugar flowers along the base, each petal shaped by her own fingers, each one slightly different from the next, because real flowers were never identical, and she had never believed in cakes that lied. Then she saw the envelope. It was a plain white envelope, sealed, with her name written across the front in the manager's handwriting. Not her full name, just Nadia, like she was being called to the head teacher's office, like she was someone who needed to be summoned. She stood there in her coat for a long moment. The kitchen was cold. The extractor fans hummed. Somewhere in the back, the walk-in refrigerator clicked and settled the way it always did around this hour. A sound she knew so well she had stopped hearing it years ago. She heard it now. She opened the envelope. She read the letter twice. The first time her eyes moved fast, pulling out words without meaning. Restructuring, performance concerns, effective immediately. The second time she read slowly, and each word landed exactly where it was aimed. 6 years. She had been inside this kitchen for 6 years. She had arrived as a junior pastry assistant at 24, knowing how to bake but not yet knowing how to build. Colin, the original head baker, a quiet Scottish man who communicated almost entirely in grunts and demonstrations, had taught her how to read an oven the way you read a person, how to feel whether a dough was right before you could explain why, how to make a decision at 2 in the morning with a collapsed meringue and a bride arriving in 7 hours, and trust your hands to find the solution before your brain caught up. Colin retired 3 years in. The head baker position went to Nadia without discussion, because there was no one else who came close. She had made cakes for a city councilman's daughter's wedding. She had made the birthday cake for a local footballer whose mother cried when she tasted it. She had stayed through power cuts, a rodent scare that was not her fault and not her responsibility but that she had handled anyway. 3 Christmas seasons that nearly broke her. And 1 February, where the cold had been so extreme that 2 of her suppliers couldn't deliver, and she had driven herself to a wholesale market at midnight to get what she needed. And now, there was a letter on top of the cake she had built with her hands. She thought about Oliver Crane. He had arrived 8 months ago as the new general manager, transferred from the company's Bristol branch with a brief to modernize the brand. He was 31, slim in the way of someone who thought about being slim, and he spoke in the carefully measured sentences of a man who had attended seminars on leadership. He walked through the kitchen on his first day with a tablet in one hand, tapping notes, nodding slowly at equipment and staff the way someone nods at things they have already decided about. He had looked at Nadia exactly the way men like him always did. The assessment was not subtle. It moved from her face to her shoulders, to the rest of her body, and then back to his tablet, all in the space of 4 seconds. She had seen that look before. She knew precisely what it was measuring, and what conclusion it reached. The complaint started 6 weeks after he arrived. First, it was a note in her file about a custom order that had allegedly gone out 30 minutes late. She had the delivery receipt. The time was correct. When she showed it to Oliver, he said the receipt time and the client's expected time were different things, and that client experience was the priority. She said the client had signed for it. He said they would monitor the situation. Then it was a comment at the weekly staff meeting about presentation standards. He had printed photographs of several cakes from a competitor's social media, all of them sharp-edged and geometrically precise, the kind of cakes that photographed beautifully and tasted of nothing in particular. He passed the photographs around the table. When they reached Nadia, he said, without looking at her, that the kitchen needed to consider whether their current output reflected the direction the brand was moving in. She did not say what she was thinking. She said that their clients consistently reported high satisfaction. He said satisfaction was only one metric. The worst moment came on a Saturday afternoon in October. The cafe floor was full. A group of women at the corner table had ordered afternoon tea. and were eating with the quiet pleasure of people who had found exactly what they wanted. Nadia had come out of the kitchen briefly to check a delivery at the back entrance, and was crossing the floor when Oliver appeared from the office doorway and said, in a voice calibrated to Carrie, that perhaps the team should have a conversation about the image that front-of-house staff and kitchen leadership projected to customers. Several people looked up. He was looking at her when he said it. There was no ambiguity about what he meant. It was not about uniforms or professionalism. It was about her body, said aloud in a room full of strangers, dressed in the language of corporate concern. The room went the specific kind of quiet that happens when people hear something ugly and choose, in that moment, whether to pretend they didn't. Most of them pretended. Nadia walked back to the kitchen. She finished her shift. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She made the afternoon pastries with the same precision she always brought, wrapped the leftover portions for the end-of-day collection, cleaned her station, and went home on the bus with her head against the cold window and something burning very quietly in the center of her chest. She had thought about complaining formally. She had sat with the idea for 2 weeks, turning it over, examining it from different angles. She knew the shape of that process well enough. She had seen a colleague go through it at a previous job, the interviews and the paper trail and the careful language on both sides, and the way the person who filed the complaint became, regardless of outcome, the person who had caused a problem. She had thought about it seriously, and then she had let it go, not because she was afraid, and not because she thought it was wrong to speak, but because she had learned a specific thing about spending your energy. Some fires you fight, and some fires you document, and keep walking. She had kept walking. Until today, when the letter was sitting on top of her cake, she set the envelope down on the work table. She looked at the wedding cake for a long time. It would go out today, to a ceremony in a hotel 30 minutes away, carried by the delivery driver who came at 8. It would stand at the end of a long table, in a room full of people who had no idea who made it. The bride and groom would cut it. Their guests would eat it. Some of them would say something nice. None of them would know her name. She took her apron off the hook by the door. She folded it carefully, smoothing the front panel, pressing the ties flat. She laid it on the counter next to the cake. She picked up her knife roll from the drawer where she always kept it, the roll of black canvas that held 12 knives she had bought one at a time over 6 years, each one chosen for a specific purpose, each one hers. She tucked it under her arm. She looked at the kitchen one more time. The familiar chaos of prep surfaces and equipment, the industrial refrigerators with their handwritten labels, the shelf where she kept her flavoring extracts in a specific order that no one else ever understood, the small burn mark on the edge of the second work table that had been there since her first month and had become, over time, something like a landmark. She turned off the light she had turned on when she arrived. She walked out of the kitchen, through the narrow service corridor, and out the back door into the February morning. The cold hit her immediately, the kind of February cold that has no interest in being polite about itself. The sky was the color of old concrete. Her breath made small clouds. She stood on the delivery step for a moment with her knife roll under her arm and 6 years of her life sitting on the other side of that door, and then she walked to the bus stop at the end of the road and waited with her hands in her pockets. She did not look back. She had never been someone who looked back. It was not stubbornness and it was not performance. It was simply that she had learned, somewhere along the way, that looking back at things that hurt you was an invitation for them to follow. You kept your eyes forward. You kept moving. You found the next thing and you built it with your hands, because your hands had never failed you and they were not about to start now. The bus came. She got on. She sat by the window. The city moved past her, wet and gray and entirely indifferent. Shops opening. People walking. The whole ordinary machinery of a Friday morning operating without any awareness that something unfair had just happened in a kitchen on a side street, that a woman with flour that she hadn't noticed yet on the cuff of her coat was sitting on a bus trying to decide what the next 6 years were going to look like. She had 42 pounds in her current account. She had a phone. She had 12 knives. She had, as it would turn out, considerably more than she knew. Nadia's flat was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been promising renovation for 4 years and had not yet delivered on that promise. The lift had been out of service since November. The hallway on her floor smelled of other people's cooking in the pleasant, specific way of hallways where nobody was going hungry, but everyone was working with a budget. Her neighbor across the hall, an older man named Jeffrey who wore the same gray cardigan every day and grew herbs on his windowsill, nodded at her when she came up the stairs and said it looked like a cold one today. She said it was indeed a cold one. She went inside, put her knife roll on the kitchen table, and stood in her small kitchen with her coat still on and looked at her oven. Her oven was not an industrial six-burner with a steam injection system and a digital temperature probe. It was a standard domestic oven that ran 10 degrees hot on the left side and took slightly longer than it claimed to reach temperature, and made a particular clicking sound on its way up to 180 that she had come to think of as its personality. It had a small crack in the door seal that she had fixed twice with heat-resistant silicone and would probably need to fix again by summer. She loved it without any embarrassment about loving it. She took her coat off. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and her phone, and she opened a blank document and began to make a list. Not a feelings list, not a grievance list, a practical list, the kind her mother had always made when something went wrong, written in the same calm hand, whether the problem was a broken boiler or a bereavement. What she had, what she needed, what she could do today. She had her knives, and her skill, and her recipes, which lived partly in notebooks and partly in her hands. She had a kitchen that was small but functional. She had a phone with a camera that took decent photographs in good light. She had 6 years of clients who had eaten her food and remembered it. What she needed was income, and she needed it within the month. What she could do today was start. She had kept a personal Instagram account for 2 years, posting photographs of cakes she made at home on weekends, never with any strategy, just because she liked photographing them, and occasionally someone liked the photograph back. She had 412 followers. Most of them were people she knew. A few were strangers who had found her through shared hashtags. She picked up her phone and took a photograph of her kitchen. Just the kitchen, the worn counter and the oven, and the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle the way February light did. She wrote a simple caption. Taking custom cake orders from this kitchen. Birthdays, weddings, any occasion. Made properly, with real ingredients, delivered personally. Message to discuss. She posted it. Then she opened her notebooks and started calculating what she could charge and still make rent. The first inquiry came 40 minutes later from a woman named Diane, who had been a regular at Prestige Patisserie, and had recognized Nadia's handle from the patisserie's own social media, where Nadia's cakes had occasionally been photographed without her name attached. Diane wanted a birthday cake for her husband, 60 years old, loved lemon, not too sweet. Could she do something beautiful? She could absolutely do something beautiful. The second inquiry came the following morning, then 2 more by the weekend. The orders were small at first, single-tier cakes, modest budgets, the kind of work that paid the electricity bill but not much else. She took every one. She delivered every one herself, carrying the boxes on the bus, or occasionally in a cab, when the order was large, and the journey was long, and the cost of the cab was worth the insurance of arriving without disaster. Word moved the way it moves in the specific channels, where people trust each other more than they trust advertisements. One of Diane's friends ordered a christening cake. That friend's colleague ordered an anniversary cake. A woman at a church in Lewisham tasted a slice at a birthday party and asked the host where it had come from, and then messaged Nadia that same evening. A family who had been clients at Prestige for years found her through a comment someone left on a community Facebook group, asking if anyone knew what had happened to the woman who used to make their Christmas cake. She began to get busier. By the 3rd month, she had filled every weekend and was taking weekday evening orders as well, working after dark when the flat was quiet, when Jeffrey's light across the hall went out, and the street below settled into its nighttime sounds. She worked with her headphones in and the radio low, and her hands moving through processes she had performed so many times they had become something close to meditation. She bought better packaging. She designed a simple label, her name, and a small logo she drew herself. She upgraded her phone for the camera. She worked out a pricing structure that was fair and not apologetic, because one of the things she had decided when she made her list on the day she was fired was that she would not underprice her own work out of the fear that people would think she was not worth what she asked. She was worth what she asked. She had learned that the hard way, and she did not intend to unlearn it. She was 7 months in, sitting at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, with invoices and a bowl of rice she had not finished, when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. Not a local number. Something with a different dialing pattern, the kind that sometimes turned out to be a scam and sometimes turned out to be something else entirely. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be listened to. He said he was calling on behalf of his employer. He said his employer had attended a wedding in December, the Alderton wedding at the Carlisle Hotel, and had tasted a cake there that he had not been able to stop thinking about since. He said his employer had made inquiries and had been given her name. He said his employer would like to commission a cake for a significant family occasion and that budget was not a constraint. She asked who his employer was. A short pause. Then he said the name. Dante Caruso. She did not know the name immediately. She said she would need to discuss the brief and could she call back tomorrow. He said of course, and gave her a number, and said his employer would look forward to hearing from her. She put the phone down. She sat with her rice going cold and her invoices in a pile, and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and typed the name into a search engine. The results loaded. She read for 20 minutes without moving. Dante Caruso was 41 years old. He was described in various articles as a businessman, an investor, and a philanthropist, with interests across hospitality, property, and private security. He had a foundation in his mother's name that funded culinary education programs in Italy and the United Kingdom. There were photographs of him at charity events and industry dinners, always well-dressed, always at a slight angle to the camera, the way people stand when they are used to being photographed, but have not made peace with enjoying it. He had been written about in a business magazine 2 years ago in a profile that praised his investment instincts and mentioned, carefully, that he maintained connections across a range of industries, some of which the writer seemed reluctant to specify. She clicked past the first page of results. The second and third pages were less restrained. There were forum posts and archived blog entries and one piece from a European newspaper, translated imperfectly, that used the word organization more than once without explaining what it referred to. There were names mentioned alongside his, and some of those names had their own search results, and those results were the kind of reading that made you check that your front door was locked. She closed the laptop. She looked at her oven. She looked at her knife roll on the counter, sitting where it always sat now, not in a drawer but out in the open, part of the furniture of her daily life. She thought about 42 pounds in a bank account, and 12 knives, and a domestic oven that ran hot on the left side. She thought about what she was being asked to do, which was bake a cake. She picked up her phone and called back the unhurried man's number. She said she was available to discuss the brief. She heard what she would later recognize as the faintest suggestion of relief in his voice, there and gone in less than a second, and something about that small involuntary sound told her more than the search results had. Even people like Dante Caruso, it turned out, cared very much about getting the right cake. The address the unhurried man sent her was in a part of the city where the streets were wider and quieter, and the houses were the kind that sat back from the road behind iron gates and old trees. She arrived in a car that had been sent for her, a dark car with a driver who introduced himself as Paul and then did not speak again, which she appreciated. She watched the city change out the window as they drove north, the shift from the familiar density of her neighborhood to something older and more settled, the architecture of money that had been in place long enough to stop trying to announce itself. The car stopped in front of a house that was large without being aggressive about it. Stone facade, sash windows, a front garden that had been planted by someone who understood that gardens were not decoration but atmosphere. Paul opened the door for her. She got out with her notebook and her pen and her phone. The door was opened before she reached it by a woman in her 50s named Margaret, who introduced herself as the housekeeper and offered tea in the same breath, the kind of simultaneous greeting and hospitality that only happens in houses where making people comfortable is a practiced art. Nadia said yes to the tea. Margaret led her through a hallway lined with framed photographs and into a kitchen. She stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for the cold efficiency of a professional space, or the intimidating perfection of an interior designer's showroom. Instead, she walked into a room that smelled of garlic and old wood and coffee, a room with copper pans hanging from a rack above the island, and a windowsill crowded with mismatched pottery, and a large wooden table in the center that had clearly been used for actual meals by actual people for a very long time. One end of the table had a ring stain from a pot that had been set down too hot, and nobody had done anything about it, and somehow that detail made her feel safer than anything else she had seen. She sat at the table. Margaret brought her tea. She looked at her notebook and thought about what she knew. A woman turning 70, a son who had been unable to stop thinking about a specific cake for 3 months. The word significant used to describe the occasion. She was making notes when Dante Caruso walked in. He was taller than the photographs suggested, and photographs had suggested considerable height. He wore a dark sweater and trousers. Nothing remarkable. The clothes of someone who had not dressed for the meeting but was also, somehow, entirely composed. His face was the kind of face that took a moment to understand, not because anything about it was unclear, but because there was more in it than you expected to find. He crossed the kitchen and held out his hand. His handshake was direct and brief. He said, "The Alderton wedding cake, the layer with orange blossom." She said, "That was mine." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone confirming a thing they were already certain of. He sat down across from her, and he told her about his mother. Her name was Rosa. She was turning 70 in 6 weeks. She had grown up in a small town on the Amalfi Coast, and she had spent 40 years in England, and she moved between both lives with the ease of someone who had never felt she needed to choose. She loved to cook. She loved to eat. She was the kind of person who experienced food as memory, who could taste a specific olive oil and be standing in her mother's kitchen at age 9, without any effort or warning. He wanted a cake that would do that. Not a cake that looked impressive, not a cake that photographed well, not a cake that demonstrated skill in obvious ways. A cake that tasted, he said, using a phrase that Nadia filed immediately into the part of her mind where the important things went, like it remembers something. She understood that completely. She did not explain why she understood it. She just opened her notebook and started asking questions. What flavors did Rosa associate with home? What textures? What time of year had she been happiest as a child? And what was growing then? What was her mother's best dish? The one she made when she wanted to say something she did not have words for. Dante answered each question with more care than she had expected. He was not a man who answered questions carelessly. But there was something beyond precision here, something closer to tenderness, the particular quality of someone talking about a person they love to someone they believe will take it seriously. She took it seriously. By the end of the conversation, she had 4 pages of notes and a direction that was clear in her mind, the way good ideas arrived, not with fanfare, but with the solid, settled feeling of a right answer. Almond and citrus, she was thinking. Candied lemon. A specific vanilla that came from a supplier she trusted. Perhaps a layer of something slightly floral that would only announce itself on the finish. Quiet enough that you had to pay attention to taste it. Present enough that you would think about it afterward. She said she would send a full proposal by the end of the week. He walked her to the front door. At the threshold he paused and said, with the directness of someone who did not routinely explain themselves but had decided to in this instance, that he had eaten cake at many occasions over many years, and had never contacted the baker before. She said she was glad he had contacted her. She said it simply, without performance. He said he was glad she had answered. Paul drove her home. She sat in the back seat with her notebook in her lap, and the quiet of the dark car around her, and thought about almond and citrus, and a woman she had not met yet who moved between 2 lives with the ease of someone who had never felt she needed to choose. She thought that was the most beautiful way she had ever heard someone described. She thought she was going to make this woman a cake that she would remember for the rest of her life. The oven at home was still clicking its way up to temperature when she put the kettle on and opened her notebooks and began. She was in Dante Caruso's kitchen for 2 days. She had proposed it in her brief, explaining that for a cake of this complexity and this significance, she worked better in the space where the cake would live, where she could understand the light and the temperature and the particular mood of the room. She expected negotiation. There was none. He said the kitchen was available. Margaret would assist if needed. She could start whenever suited her. She arrived on a Thursday morning with 2 bags of ingredients, her knife roll, and the particular focus she felt when she was doing work that mattered. Margaret made her coffee before she had taken her coat off, and she liked Margaret immediately and without qualification. She worked. The first day was foundation. She made the base components separately, testing each one alone before she considered how they would speak to each other. Almond sponge, light, but with a density at the center that held up to the other flavors. A lemon curd, sharp enough to cut through sweetness. A buttercream with a vanilla base that she adjusted 4 times before it was right, standing at the counter with a spoon, and the particular internal silence of tasting something and listening to what it was telling her. Margaret sat at the kitchen table through much of this, not intruding, occasionally offering observations that were worth hearing. She had worked for the Caruso family for 11 years, and she spoke about Rosa the way people speak about someone they genuinely love, with the easy warmth of daily familiarity. She said Rosa came for dinner on the first Sunday of every month without fail. She said Rosa could tell within 2 bites whether something had been made with care or with speed, and she did not keep the verdict to herself. Nadia said she would keep that in mind. Dante came through the kitchen 3 times on the first day, once to bring her coffee without asking how she took it, which he got correct, because he had simply watched her take the first one. Once to stand in the doorway for a moment and look at the work on the counter, before nodding fractionally and leaving. Once to tell Margaret that he would be in meetings until 7, and to ask if Nadia needed anything else. She said she was fine. She was not being polite. She was genuinely fine in the way of someone who is exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they know how to do. The second day was assembly. She built the cake in the morning, each tier measured and level, the components coming together the way she had planned them. She worked in the quiet that she always preferred for this part, the precise focusing quiet of hands and eyes, and the particular intelligence that lived in the junction between them. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. She barely noticed. She was finishing the final tier in the evening, piping a border of candied lemon peel, with the fine work she did slowly and without watching the clock, when she became aware that Dante had come in and sat down on the other side of the island. She kept working. He did not speak immediately. He watched in the way she had noticed he did most things, with genuine attention and without the performance of interest. After some minutes, he said, "How did you come to do this independently?" She did not look up from the piping. She told him, not everything, the shape of it. 6 years, a new manager, a letter on top of her cake. She said, "They decided I wasn't the right image." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "They removed you." "They did." Another silence. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind that happens when something is being considered seriously. He said, "Their loss appears to have been arranged by the universe specifically for my benefit." She looked up at that. He was not quite smiling, but there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. An opening, small and deliberate, the kind that is offered only once, and without announcement. She held his gaze for one moment and then returned to her piping. But she felt the warmth of it. She filed it carefully in the same place she had filed the phrase about remembering something, where she kept the things that mattered, and did not need to be said again. The cake was finished at 11 that night. She stood back from it. It was 4 tiers, ivory pale, hand-finished with the candied lemon along the base, and a spray of pressed sugar flowers at the top that she had made from scratch, each one shaped the way she had shaped the flowers at Prestige Patisserie. Each one slightly different, because real flowers never repeated. Margaret came to look. She stood beside Nadia and looked at the cake for a long time. Then she said, in the quiet way of someone who has seen many things and is not easily impressed, "Rosa is going to love this." Nadia cleaned her station. She packed her tools. Dante walked her to the front door at 11:30. The house settled and quiet around them. At the door he stopped and asked, in the same direct way he asked everything, whether she had good light in her workspace. She said her kitchen ran hot on the left side, and the light was decent in the afternoon. He said, "That should not be the case for someone who works the way you do." She said, "A lot of things should not be the case." He looked at her. A long, considered look. "No," he said quietly. "They should not." She went home in the car Paul drove and sat with her hands in her lap and thought about sugar flowers and second chances, and the way some conversations said everything they needed to say without arriving at the conclusion out loud. Rosa Caruso turned 70 on a Saturday in November, and the party was held in the large dining room of the house that also contained the kitchen Nadia had spent 2 days in, the kitchen that now felt, in some way she could not entirely explain, like a place she had been before even though she had only recently been there for the first time. Nadia had not been invited to the party. She had delivered the cake that morning, arriving at 9 with Paul's help to carry the tiers in from the car, assembling them in the kitchen under Margaret's watchful eye, adding the final decorative elements that she had saved for last, because they were delicate and transport was unkind to delicate things. She had stood back and checked it from every angle. She had made small adjustments to the sugar flowers. She had made sure the stand was level. Then she had left, because her work was done, and she was not a guest, and she understood the difference. She spent the afternoon at home with her notebooks, working on a proposal for a new client, and tried not to think about whether the cake had been cut yet, and whether Rosa had liked it. Her phone rang at 4 in the afternoon. It was Margaret, calling from the house, and her voice was doing something complicated that Nadia could not immediately identify. Margaret said Rosa had tasted the cake. Then she said Rosa had gone very still. Then she said Rosa had looked at her son and said something in Italian, and Dante had looked at the cake for a moment, and then asked Margaret to call Nadia. Nadia asked what Rosa had said. Margaret paused. Then she said, gently, she said it tasted like her mother's hands. Nadia sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because her legs gave way, exactly. More because she needed to be closer to the ground for a moment. She sat with her back against the cabinet and her phone in her hand, and the afternoon light coming through the window low and pale. And something moved through her that was not quite crying, and not quite relief, and not quite either of those things, but was perhaps the feeling that happens when you make something with your whole self, and it lands exactly where you aimed it. She said, "Tell her I'm very glad." Margaret said, "I already did." 3 weeks later, the calls began. The first was from a hotel in the city, asking whether she was available for a corporate event in February. They had been given her name, they said, by Dante Caruso. The second was from a private members club in Mayfair, same attribution. Then a gallery, then a diplomat's family, then an events company that organized high-end private functions across the city. She counted them. 11 calls in 4 weeks. 11 introductions from one man who had tasted one cake. She began to hire. First a single assistant on weekend days, a young woman named Cora who had trained at a culinary college and had quick hands and a good eye, and who laughed easily, which mattered in a kitchen. Then a part-time driver. When the deliveries became too numerous to manage alone, she moved her operation from the flat kitchen to a rented commercial space in a railway arch nearby. Small but clean and legal and equipped with 2 proper ovens that did not run hot on either side. She kept the domestic oven. She was not sure she could explain why. Some things you held on to not because they were practical, but because they were the thing you had when you had nothing else. And discarding them felt like forgetting something you needed to remember. The world that had felt very small in February, 42 pounds and a knife roll and a folded apron left on a counter, had become considerably larger. Not through luck, not through rescue, through her own hands and 6 years of knowledge, and the specific stubbornness of a person who does not look back at things that hurt them. And then there was the evening in December, when Dante called, not through the unhurried man's number, but on a line she recognized now as his personal one, and said there was something he wanted to discuss. He said the foundation was holding a dinner in the new year, a charity event in support of culinary education programs. He said they wanted to include a recognition element, stories of people working in food whose paths had been unusual, and whose work represented what the foundation was trying to support. He said he would like her to be there. Not as a vendor, he added, as a guest, as someone being recognized. She was quiet for a moment. She asked what recognition meant in practical terms. He said a short presentation, her name in the program, and perhaps a conversation with the guests after dinner. She said she did not love being presented. He said he understood that. He said Rosa would be there, and Rosa had told him to call Nadia and tell her she expected to see her. Nadia smiled at her kitchen wall. She said she would attend. The dinner was held in January, in a room in a building that had high ceilings and old chandeliers, and the feeling of somewhere that had seen a great many things and kept them to itself. Nadia wore a deep green dress and her own shoes, and the earrings her mother had given her years ago, gold drops that she wore only when she felt the occasion was worth it. Rosa was in the front row in a burgundy jacket, sitting straight-backed, the way of someone who had decided in youth that posture was a form of dignity and had never revised the decision. When Nadia entered the room, Rosa turned her head and found her immediately, as though she had known exactly where to look. She raised one hand, a small gesture, the kind that carries weight precisely because it is not large. Nadia raised hers back. The presentation was brief and without excess. A woman named Caroline from the Foundation's board spoke about the program's goals and then turned it over to a short film that told, in 2 minutes, the story of what Nadia had built. It was factual and clean. It said she had been dismissed from a senior baking position in a manner that had no basis in her performance, that she had started her own operation from her home kitchen, and that her work was now considered among the finest custom confectionery in the city. It said her name above the door of her current space was her own. The room applauded. Nadia stood at the front and received it with the particular stillness of someone who feels a thing deeply and does not perform it. Afterward, in the quieter space of the hallway where the guests moved between the dinner room and the drinks, Dante came to stand beside her, not in the way of someone claiming proximity or making a statement, just a man standing near a person he wanted to speak with. He said, "There is something I have been thinking about." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The Foundation has a space attached to it. A kitchen, properly sized. Good light. It has been sitting unused because we could not find the right person to give it a purpose. I would like to discuss whether you would consider it as a base for your operation, with the option to expand the culinary education element if it interested you." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I would need full independence over the work." He said, "That was always assumed." She said, "And my name on the door." He looked at her, a look she knew by now, the one that was direct and steady, and that held more in it than it said. "Obviously," he said, "the door wouldn't mean anything with any other name on it." She thought about a February morning, and a folded apron, and a bus moving through gray light. She thought about 42 pounds, and 12 knives, and a crack in a door seal, fixed twice with silicone. She thought about the specific weight of a letter sitting on top of a cake you spent 14 hours making. She thought about a woman who tasted something and went still, and said it tasted like her mother's hands. She said, "Then let's talk." They stood in the hallway with the sound of the dinner behind them, and the city outside, and the particular brightness of a moment that was very ordinary in its form. Two people at a party having a conversation, and entirely extraordinary in what it was actually doing, which was deciding what came next. She had not looked back in 11 months. She did not intend to start now. She looked forward, at a man who had called a baker by name, in a room where no one expected it, and at the door that was already, in some way she could feel if not yet see, beginning to bear her name. Nadia's opened in September, and the city noticed. Not in the loud way of press releases and launch events, though there was a small gathering on the opening day. Rosa Caruso sitting in the front near the window in a yellow cardigan, drinking tea with the satisfied expression of someone watching a thing they had privately believed in arrive at its correct destination. The space was a converted arch, the same style as her previous rental, but more generously sized, with proper lighting above the workstations, and a second kitchen in the back dedicated to the education program that had begun, tentatively, with 2 evenings a week. Cora was still with her. There were 3 other people on the team now, each one chosen with the same care Nadia brought to every decision. She did not hire quickly. She did not compromise. She had learned, somewhere in the space between losing a job and building a livelihood, that the standards you set in small moments determine everything that follows. The waitlist for custom orders reached 4 months within the first week. Not because of any single article or any promotion campaign, but because of the particular momentum of a reputation built by people tasting something and telling other people about it immediately, with the specific urgency of those who have just discovered that a thing they believed was rare is available. Prestige Patisserie was reviewed in a food column that autumn. The reviewer noted that the kitchen had lost its distinctive quality in the past year, and that something essential seemed to have departed. The comments below the piece filled without any prompting, with people asking whether anyone knew what had happened to the woman who used to make their orders. Someone mentioned Nadia's by name. Then several others did. She did not read the comment section. Her sister read it and called her about it. And Nadia listened and said yes, and then asked whether her sister wanted anything from the market, because she was going past it on Thursday. Oliver Crane's name does not appear beyond this sentence. That is the correct amount of space to give him. There was one morning in October, early, the arch not yet fully lit and the day not yet started, when Nadia unlocked the front door and stood in the entrance of the space and looked at the sign above it, her name, in clean letters, on a door that was hers. She had a cup of coffee in one hand. Her knife roll was already on the work table inside. She stood there for perhaps a minute, not looking back, just looking at the name, the letters of it, the fact of it, the particular way it felt to see your own name on a door that nobody could take down without asking you first. Then she went inside, turned on the lights, put her coffee on the counter, and got to work. Because the morning orders were in, and the ingredients were prepped, and the ovens needed time to reach temperature, and there was, as always, a great deal to do. And she had always been, above everything else, someone who did the work. The orange blossom cake remained the thing people talked about, the signature, the one that appeared in every description of what Nadia's was, and why it was worth the wait list and the journey. People tried to describe it in reviews and recommendations and messages to friends. They reached for words and found that the words were not quite sufficient. It tasted, they said, like something they remembered. They could not always say what. That was, Nadia knew, exactly right. Rosa came on the first Sunday of every month. She always sat at the table near the window, always ordered the same thing, and always stayed long enough to talk to whoever else happened to be sitting nearby, in the easy way of someone who found strangers immediately interesting. She and Nadia developed the comfortable shorthand of women who understood each other without extensive explanation, a warmth that had no single origin point, but was simply present, the way certain things were simply present when they were true. Dante came when he came, not on a schedule, not with announcement, just occasionally there in the late morning when the space was at its fullest and the smell of baking was at its best, sitting with a coffee and his phone, and the particular quality of stillness he carried with him. They talked when there was time. Sometimes there was not much time, and the talking was brief and enough. Sometimes there was more, and the conversation went where conversations go, when two people are paying genuine attention to each other. She did not perform ease around him. She did not manufacture it. It arrived on its own, over time, the way comfort between people who respect each other always does, slowly, and without ceremony, and then all at once. On a morning in November, the 2nd November since the space had opened, she was in the back kitchen testing a new element for the winter menu when he appeared in the doorway. He had let himself in through the front because Margaret had a key and had asked Cora to let him through, and Cora had done so, and then said nothing about it, because Cora had excellent instincts. He watched her work for a moment. Then he said, "I have a question." She said, "Ask it." He said, "Rosa's 71st is in December. She has specifically requested you make the cake again. I told her I would ask." She said, "Of course." He said, "She also said, and I am passing this along precisely as she said it, that she expects you to come for dinner this time, not to deliver it, to eat it with us." Nadia was quiet for a moment. She thought about the first time she had stood in that kitchen, the copper pans and the ring stain on the table, and the smell of garlic and old wood. She thought about a woman she had not yet met who moved between two lives without ever having to choose. She said, "I'll be there." He said, "Good." He turned to leave. At the doorway he paused. The way he had paused at the front door of his house the night she finished the first cake, and said, without turning fully around, she said one more thing. Nadia waited. She said she hopes you know, he said, that some people arrive in a kitchen and know how to use it, and some people arrive in a kitchen and change what it was for. She says you are the second kind. He left. Nadia stood at her work table in the back kitchen of a space with her name above the door, in a city that had once not known who she was, with her hands resting on the counter, and the ovens warm behind her, and the morning coming through the high windows in the long level way of November light. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden surface, felt the grain of it, and got back to work.